Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. So once again, I am with first year students. So I welcome you all in my YouTube channel, Exploring the Concepts. So today's topic is from chapter number 8, Diversity Among Plants. And my today's topic is Angiosperms, Enclosed Seeded Plants. So first of all, I want to share my learning objectives of my today's video tutorial. That is to understand the introduction and life cycle of angiospermic plants. So my first topic is about what are angiosperms, how are they have spent their life, what are the major characteristics and the the structure, the structural parts of the angiosperms, and then the development of the male gametophyte as far as the life cycle is concerned. So we are discussing male gametophyte in our today's video, and female gametophyte, development of the female gametophyte would be in the next video. So then is understanding of all of the meanings of all of the related terms related to male gametophyte. So let us start with the angiosperms. First of all, I want to show you something, some angiospermic plants. Look at the diagram below. I'm sorry, it's an image, and thank you for the all of the images. Thank you, Google. So all of these plants have flowers, right? So the very first point about angiosperms that they have flowers. They bear flowers in these plants, right? And that's why they're also called as the flowering plants. And no other plants have the flowers, right? No other groups of the plants have the flowers in them, but in angiosperms. Secondly, they have the fruits as well, right? You can see in the diagram above showing you the oranges, and it means that they have fruits in them as well. And all of the seeds, they are present inside the fruit. That's why they are basically the word angiosperms, basically enclosed seeded plants or enclosed seed plants. Seeds are found present inside the fruit or inside the ovary. But as far as gymnosperms are concerned, they too are the seeded plants, but the seeds are not enclosed inside their fruit. Another example, these are the apples, and then a beautiful tree having the flowers on it. A beautiful example of angiosperms, right? So what is they are? They are the flowering plants. So let's discuss this diagram. This is basically the parts of the flower, right? You all know already, obviously, you have discussed this topic in your 10th grade as well. So let's discuss the parts of the flower. So every flower have four parts, right? One of them is calyx, then corolla, then androecium and gynoecium. I'm going to recall, I'm going to repeat the names: calyx, corolla, androecium, gynoecium. So calyx is also called as the sepals. Sepals are the outermost covers or covering of the plant, and they are basically green in color. And then you can this sepal is basically visible during when the flower is in bud form. They are basically protective in nature, and they are always green in color. And as far as petals are concerned, they are also called as the corolla of the petals. They are the colored part of the flower. Most of the flowers have the petals in them. And then is the androecium. Androecium is actually the stem. Let me take my pointer. No, I don't. I cannot take at that time. So this is the stamen. Stamen is basically have two parts. One of them is anther, the other is filament, right? This is the anther, and this is the filament. Collectively, it is called as the stamen. A single unit of androecium, by the way, is called as the stamen. And this is where the third word of the flower. As you all know, there are four whorls. The outermost whorl is basically the outermost circle, you can say, is basically the sepal. The next circle is basically the corolla. The next circle is of androecium. Finally, the innermost circle is gynoecium or carpel. And carpel have three parts: stigma, style, and ovary, right? This is a stigma, this is a style, this is ovary, right? It has three parts, and this is innermost part of the flower, and it's also called as gynoecium. So this is the female reproductive part. Androecium is the male reproductive parts. So there are the parts of the flower, right? Next, the characteristics. The very first characteristic, they are the flowering plants. We already have discussed this. We have seen the examples of the flowers and the fruits. They are characteristics of angiosperms is basically they are major characteristics. They are flowering and their seeds are enclosed inside the fruits, right? These two features, please do not forget them. Next is the leaves bearing ovules are folded and joined at the margins from ovaries. So they have the margins of the ovaries, they have joined to each other, and they have, they have formed a circular structure, a cylindrical structure, you can say, which is called as ovaries. That's why the ovules are present now inside the ovaries, which are converting into the seeds. Ovary after fertilization changed into fruit, and ovary, right? The ripened ovary is basically the fruit. The ripened ovary is basically the fruit. Large group of organisms are there, and angiosperm is the also called as the modern plants, the the most adaptable plants, the most adapted to the environment. So they are basically the largest group, right? So they are divided into two main groups, trichots and monocots. We will discuss later in the lectures. So they have vascular tissues, obviously, plant body differentiated, right? You can easily identify the stems, the roots, the leaves, the branches, and other parts as well. So then is the flowers, fruits, and seeds are also present in this group of organisms. So these are the major characteristics of angiosperms. You can easily discuss and you can easily write about the angiosperms. If you can take an example of a fruit tree, so then is alternation of generation, a very important feature of all of the plants, right? Alternation of generation is a very, very important feature. You all know that there is an alternation of generations in plants. One of the generation is a sporophyte, the other one is gametophyte generation. One of the generation is a sporophyte, the other is gametophyte generation. This is the sporophyte generation. The sporophyte generation is diploid, right? Sporophyte generation, spore producing generation. As it is going to produce the spore, that's why they are called as a sporophyte. And please take this in your mind, keep this in your mind that this is a sporophyte generation and it is spore producing generation, right? So sporophyte generation, all of the plants you can see around yourself and in the gardens, in the lawns, in the parks, all of these trees basically are the examples of sporophyte plant, right? Sporophyte generation. And they are diploid, right? Every cell of the plant is, by the way, diploid and it is a sporophyte. Okay, now they have the flowers in them, and inside the flower there are two parts. I already have told you, androecium and gynoecium. These that androecium and gynoecium, they can go for the next step, which is the meiosis. Right? This is meiosis. Um, meiosis on After completing the meiosis, sporophyte generation will produce spores which are haploid, and these spores, obviously, few of the spores are the male spores, and a few are the male spores, and few are the female spores, and they are haploid, obviously, as they are the result of the meiosis. So when these haploid spores, they fall on, this is all about the lower plants. In that case, the male and female spores, they fall on the ground on the fertile land, and then they will develop into the male and female gametophyte generations, and then they will they are going to that, as you know, the gametophyte generation is actually gamete producing generation. That's why it's called as gametophyte generation. But as you all know that this generation is actually the result of a haploid spore. So that's why this gametophyte generation is haploid, right? So gametophyte generation is going to produce the gametes, and these gametes are produced through mitosis. Why? Because the whole plant body is haploid. That's why they are unable to go through meiosis. Plants, you can say that plants are the only organisms that can produce the gametes through mitosis. Rest of the groups, they will go for meiosis for the production of the gametes, right? So on mitosis, they will produce gametes. These gametes on their fertilization will formed the zygote. Zygote is actually the first cell of the sporophyte generation, and after meiosis it will converting into a sporophyte plant or sporophyte generation, the adult of sporophyte generation. Then once again sporophyte generation has gone through the meiosis and the cycle will keep on going. So there is an alternation one. It will basically, there is an advantage of this generation because it's not the story of today, but in ancient time when there is a very less amount of plants on the land, there is a need of the alternation of generation. There is a need of the the higher number of the growths in the plants. So asexual reproduction, it's a means of reproduction in which you can produce a large number of organisms and identical organisms as well. So that's why once they will go for the large number of organisms, but obviously they also need the production of the variety in them, because they need to develop the organisms which are most adaptive to their environment. So they also need the sexual reproduction as well. So so nature has decided to to create or to produce a mechanism for the production of a large number of organisms along with the genetic variations as well. So alternation of generation gives plants a chance for their survival along with the genetic variations as well. So sporophyte generation is actually the sexual phase of the the plants, and gametophyte generation is actually the asexual phase, right? So this is how they alternate. So please keep this in mind: sporophyte generation, spore producing generation, and it is diploid, and through meiosis it will produce spores. And gametophyte generation, gamete producing generation, and it will produce gametes through mitosis. Please keep this in your mind: plants are the organisms, they will produce gametes through mitosis. So okay, let's discuss the text. You can so dominant diploid sporophyte generation in angiosperms. Angiosperms have dominant sporophyte generation and dependent gametophyte generation. And then its main plant body is a sporophyte, which produces the spores. So this is the reproductive part of the angiosperm. It is called as the flower. It has two parts. This square is basically indicating you the gynoecium, and that square is basically indicating you the androecium. Gynoecium, the innermost part, and the next to it is androecium. Androecium is the spore, going to produce a microsporangia in it, microspores, right? And as it is the sporophyte generation, and this is the gynoecium, and it is going to produce the ovum or egg inside there, the ovary. So flower is the reproductive structure. It bears anthers and carpels as male and female reproductive structures respectively. Development of male gametophyte. Now, the major part of today's lesson is development of male gametophyte. Look at this diagram. It looks so difficult right now, but it will become easy with the passage of time. So this is the flower, an angiospermic flower. I'm taking that box, and we will discuss this box today, by the way. So this is anther. Anther has specific structure inside it. We will discuss a few minutes, after a few minutes. So this is anther. Anther is going through a process, meiosis, and going to produce microspores, right? Inside the anther, microspores are going to produce, and then on mitosis, it will develop into male gametophyte generation, right? Okay, so this is how the male gametophyte generation will develop. Okay, let's start with the anther, the structure of the anther. Anther is basically this part of the stamen. This is the structure called filament. Collectively, the two parts are a stamen. When you are going to cut it like this, the cross-sectional area, it's going to show you the pollen sacs, right? Inside the anther, we have pollen sacs, and these pollen sacs basically have the microspore mother cells, right? Microspores mother cells, though you can also call them as microsporocyte, right? Okay, so look at this. This is once again another diagram showing you the pollen sacs, right? This is the anther, which is tetrathecus, right? It has four pollen sacs in which they have microsporocyte or microspore mother cell. You can see in this diagram the dark brown region is pollen sac. Inside it there are pollen mother cells which are diploid, obviously, which can have the capability to go through the meiosis. Then this is how they are going to develop into pollen grains. This is the site for the production of pollen grains, right? Um, anthers have pollen sacs in them. Pollen sacs have microsporocytes or microspore mother cells inside the pollen sac, and these pollens are basically responsible for the production of pollen grains. Okay, then is pollen grain formation. Now, how it is responsible? This is microspore mother cell, right? Microspores they are called as microspores because they are smaller in size. Male gamete is basically smaller in size. That's why they are called as microspores, right? This is the microspore mother cell. It is diploid on meiosis. It will develop into four haploid microspores, right? Four haploid. One microspore mother cell will develop into four haploid mother cells. So they have produced four separated pollen grains. This is the structure of a pollen grain. It has, by the way, two nuclei. We will discuss later. It has two nuclei and it has outer covering is thick as well. Okay, so this is how it is going to develop. This is anther. Anther has pollen sacs. Pollen sacs have pollen microspore mother cells. Microspore mother cells will go through meiosis and they are going to produce four haploid microspores. And then this is the inner coat and this is the outer coat of the spore. This is, by the way, the structure of the microspore. Okay, so these cells mature to form pollen grains. Then tube cells and new generative nucleus. It has two nuclei. This pollen grain has two nuclei. This is basically developed through mitosis. It has just one nuclei in it first, and later on it will produce through mitosis two nuclei. One of them is called as tube nucleus, the other is called as the generative. This generative nucleus divides by mitosis, and it will produce once again through mitosis. It will produce two mature male gametes or the sperm nuclei, right? So, a mature pollen grain has three nuclei, right? A mature pollen grain has three nuclei. Mitotic divisions produce local masses called microspore mother cells, and after meiosis, two microsporocytes, four, one and microspores are produced, right? So, microspores on mitosis produces two-celled pollen grain. This is the two-celled pollen grain. Okay, then is the protection to the pollen grain. So it has two layers. Please keep this in your mind. This is very important to note. It has exine, a thick layer. The outermost covering is called as exine, and the innermost thin layer is called as entine. These two layers are very, very important on germination. These two layers will break, and then the sperm nuclei will get entered inside the female reproductive part. A tough wall develops around the pollen grain to protect the content of the pollen grain from drying out. So this is basically they protect the plant from desiccation. So this is the female part. This is the stigma, style, and ovary, right? So when pollen grain falls on the stigma, the stigma is basically somewhat sticky because of the production of some chemical. This is responsible for attachment of the pollen grain to the stigma, right? And then the tube nucleus is capable of producing the tube pollen tube, right? Okay. uh, this is basically cells on the surface of the stigma secrete a sticky nutrient, right? Fluid containing sugar and other substances. After pollination, pollen grain germinates on stigma, so they will germinate on the stigma because the stigma has the capability to keep them alive by providing the energy, and they can stick to the stigma as well. So on entering, what hell else will happen? Obviously, this is the pollen grain, which the two nuclei, and this is generative nucleus. Once again, this will go for another mitosis. So after mitosis, it will form two sperm nuclei and the pollen nucleus. This is responsible for the development of pollen tube, right? So each pollen grain produces a thin cylinder pollen tube, and pollen tube grows down through the tissue of the stigma, style, and ovary until it reaches the ovule. Basically, the purpose of the pollen tube is the guided, the guided pathway of the sperm nuclei to the ovaries, right? Because ovaries are much protected. Ovules, first of all, the flower has the innermost part is ovary, and ovary has ovule, and ovules do have a specific covering, so it is very difficult for the pollen now to reach to the the ovary or the ovule. So pollen tube it is very helpful, and it is actually helpful in delivering the sperm nuclei to the ovaries of the plants. So, as the pollen tube develops, two nuclei of pollen grains moves into it. Two are called generative nuclei, and one is tube nucleus. Generative nucleus divides to form two elongated sperms, and generative nucleus is at the tip of the pollen tube with the sperms following behind. So, tube nucleus is present at the tip, such as they are responsible for the development of the pollen tube. Pollen tube containing tube nucleus and the two sperms is the male gametophyte. Now, this is basically called as the male gametophyte when microspore has a small sized pollen tube, and it has containing two nuclei. So this is basically called as the male gametophyte, right? This is basically the male gametophyte, and you can see that these nuclei are produced through mitosis. That's why we call that gametophyte generation is basically haploid, and it is gamete producing, and it is gamete producing. Okay. Now I'm hoping that this part of the diagram will be completed. This is the anther. On meiosis, microspore forms pollen grain. Mitosis, pollen grain will gametophyte, and on pollination, it will reach up to this position, right? I have completed all this portion. So all the best from my side. I'm hoping that this would be helpful to you all. Please write me in the comment box for further, the improvement of the channel. I need your feedback. It's very important for me and for the channel as well. Thank you so much. Please take a very good care of yourself. Allah Hafiz.